For those of you who are at home and for those of you who are here, welcome to Esau and Jacob, Tribalism in the Family. I'm going to begin with prayer. O God, the creator and preserver of all mankind, we humbly beseech thee for all sorts and conditions of men, that thou wouldest be pleased to make thy ways known unto them, thy saving health unto all nations. More especially we pray for thy holy church universal, that it may be so guided and governed by thy good Spirit, that all who profess and call themselves Christians may be led into the way of truth, and hold the faith in unity of spirit, in the bond of peace, and in righteousness of life. Finally, we commend to thy fatherly goodness all those who are in any ways afflicted or distressed in mind, body, or estate, that it may please thee to comfort and relieve them according to their several necessities, giving them patience under their sufferings, and a happy issue out of all their afflictions. All this we beg for Jesus Christ's sake. Amen. I'm going to put my microphone on now. I have noticed in society generally that we are becoming extremely tribalistic, and it's maybe perhaps a more evident tribalism that I see in society and that actually takes place in the church as well. I have been praying about that a lot, preaching about that occasionally, and thinking about it a lot. And I was listening to a wonderful podcast today where someone was talking that tribalism isn't really a new thing. It's been around for a long time. And one of the ways that person was talking about it was he was a Jewish guy who grew up in Brooklyn. And he said he could walk about 20 blocks in any direction and only see Jews. And he said it was the same way in the Italian neighborhoods in New York. You walk, if you're in the middle of that neighborhood, you can walk 20 blocks in any direction, only see Italian people. In the Spanish neighborhood, same thing. In the black neighborhood, same thing. And so we've had tribalism. Tribalism has been something that we've always had. And you saw occasionally, New York City is a great example of this, on those borders where those neighborhoods existed, sometimes you'd see violence happen. Because I think borders no longer exist in a lot of relational ways, social media especially, and you can include lots of things in social media that aren't just what kids are using, right? Or just Facebook. It's, as we've seen, YouTube, Reddit, even email is a form, and text messaging is a form of social media. And so because community, virtual community, is so easily accessible, those borders get closer and you can have much more conflict. And so I received a question in the fireside chat from Ann Moe about Esau and Jacob and did they ever reconcile? It's a question, and we'll get there in our third class. But today, I want to talk a little bit about tribalism and where I think tribalism comes from. And we're actually going to back up from Esau and Jacob to see if tribalism is an issue before them. So, tribalism, the new or old threat to relationship with God. What is the cause of our current tribalism? I believe that relativism, or moral relativism, is one of them. Relativism is the belief that truth is not objective, but subjective, and relative to the circumstances. Relativism says that the truth is in the eye of the beholder. It says that moral propositions do not reflect absolute and universal moral truths, but instead are relative to social, cultural, historical, or personal references, and that there is no single standard by which to assess a moral proposition's truth. Relativism insists that morality, cultures, and beliefs are all of equal value, meaning, and worth. It asserts that what is true for one person might not be true for another, and each person can decide for him or herself what is true and what is good. Popular expressions of relativism include comments such as, "This is true for me, and so I believe it," and "What's right for you might not be right for me." So, continuing, the day before his election as Pope, Benedict said that relativism, which is letting oneself be tossed and swept along by every wind of teaching, looks like the only attitude acceptable to today's standards. He warned, "We are moving toward dictatorship of relativism, which does not recognize anything as for certain, and which as its highest goal, one's own ego and one's own desire." And so, the way I'm doing this, I can't see my slides ahead of time. I wish I could. But what we see with relativism and tribalism, you can very easily reject someone else as wrong because you feel like they're wrong. And when you have a philosophy like relativism that is becoming, I think, ever more present beginning probably in the 20th century and really powerful now, Pope John Paul II wrote against relativism as a great heresy. And so what you have is the ability to reject truth because it doesn't fit what you want. So as Christians, we have to accept that there are ultimate truths. Jesus Christ died on the cross for the atonement of all of mankind who choose to believe in him. God is a Trinity, so on and so forth. There are absolute truths. Though moral relativism did not become a prominent topic in philosophy or elsewhere until the 20th century, it has ancient origins. In the classical Greek world, both historian Herodotus and the sophist Protagoras appeared to endorse some form of relativism. The latter attracted the attention of Plato in the Theaetetus. So, if you remember the sophists, what they were who Plato hated the most, because Plato believed in truth. He believed there were absolute truths, and what the sophists did was, no offense to any lawyers, if there's any lawyers in the room, the sophists would argue a case for money, kind of like a lawyer would. And so it wasn't about coming up with the right answer, the true answer. It was about arguing a case for money. So here's my theory. Satan's first temptation of humanity comes in the form of giving man the knowledge of good and evil. This is the beginning of relativism, because it is the rejection of obedience of God's perfect truth. From this, humanity creates tribes, which are at once at war with each other. Once humanity chooses what is right and wrong, we will go to war over who's right and who's wrong. So, if you think about the Christian teaching, baptismal covenant, loving, honoring, if you look at the book of Acts, the way the early church worked a lot of things out in the very beginning before they started getting into arguments with each other and creating tribes, right? Because you see tribalism in the church, we call them denominations. Okay? So, you see, before you see this happening, that if you take any philosophy, take religion out of it. Let's pretend religion no longer exists, and we are a culture of people that want to create a perfect society, and we have to choose one pure form, pure teaching. The philosophy is obviously Christianity, because it's about sacrificial love. The entire point of Christianity, everything that God reveals to us, is that God loves us sacrificially, and that we need to obey the rules that he's given us. And when humanity discovers the knowledge of good and evil in that first temptation, humanity then gets to decide right and wrong for themselves, as opposed to being perfectly in tune with the will of God. If we're perfectly in tune with the will of God, we don't sin. We can't sin. So we're going to go back into the Bible, and we're going to take a look at how humanity decides right and wrong as opposed to obeying God, and how that causes us to divide ourselves into tribes. Cain and Abel. Now Adam knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord. And again, she bore his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a worker of the ground. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel also brought the firstborn of his flock and the fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his face fell. The Lord said to Cain, Why are you angry, and why has your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire, sin's desire, is contrary to you, but you must rule over it. If you do well, will you not be accepted? Means that there was something inherently wrong with Cain's offering to God. We don't know what that is. You can guess that he didn't give with his whole heart. He didn't want to give. But what I really want to focus on is sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you. And I thought that image is really an interesting image of sin crouching at the door. Take a minute and think about your own personal life and how sin is right now crouching at the door. Decisions we make every day, sin is crouching at the door. Now think about the times you've given in and the times you haven't. Every time we give in, it's selfishness. It's putting our will, our desire, our concern, our fear over that of someone else or of God's. And sometimes we might argue with ourselves and say, no, I was doing that for someone else because that person needed me to do that for them. But you know you're really doing it for yourself. Cain spoke to Abel his brother, and when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, Where is Abel your brother? He said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? And the Lord said, What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground. And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. You shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. In other words, there's consequences when we decide what is right. Cain said to the Lord, My punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, you have driven me today away from the ground, and from your face I shall be hidden. I shall be a fugitive and wander on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. Then the Lord said to him, Not so. If anyone kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord put a mark on Cain, lest anyone who found him should attack him. Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Cain becomes separate from his family and begins a new family. One tribe becomes two tribes. Sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it. So I don't know if you can see that clearly. Yes, you can. You see two tribes. God created this family to be one. And when the family stopped loving each other sacrificially and only caring about self, disaster, murder. And from that murder, you have a tribe being created. So this is a major event, but I want us to think about in our own families, because that's where everything starts. In our own families, how can we be tribal? The crazy uncle at Thanksgiving. Whether you're a conservative family and the crazy liberal uncle comes, or you're a progressive family and the crazy conservative uncle comes. How can we die to self, die to our own will, to prevent tribes from being formed? And so one of the reasons I show this is, and this is going to be a theme, we've seen now two tribes have been formed, and the long, painful results that come out of those tribes, and the long-standing enemies that develop. We define sin as doing the will of self over the will of God. Sin is not defined as doing bad things. That's the childhood definition of sin. That's the simple definition of sin. You did something bad. In fact, anything we do for self and not for the glory of God is sinful. The definition of sin is almost the same definition as relativism. Sin creates tribes because we care not for God's will, but for only our own. And how often is it that we mask our own will in doing something for someone else? Next story. Abraham and Lot. Although he's Abram at this point. He hasn't become Abraham yet. So Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him, into the Negeb. Now Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver and in gold, and he journeyed on from the Negeb as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the first place where he had made an altar at first. Does anyone remember how Abraham acquired all those cows and gold and silver? He didn't trust God, and he served himself instead of trusting God, and told Pharaoh that his beautiful wife Sarai was his sister. So Pharaoh took her as his wife, and then Pharaoh started being cursed, and then realized he was being cursed because God was cursing him because he took someone else's wife. And so Pharaoh said, take all this stuff and get out of here, because I want to be good. So that's how he gets a lot of this stuff. So I'm not casting Abram as a perfect saint in this story, but he's more trusting than Lot. And there Abram called upon the name of the Lord, and Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, so that the land could not support both of them dwelling together, for their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abraham's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. And at the time the Canaanites and the Perizzites were dwelling in the land. Then Abraham said to Lot, "Let there be no strife between you and me, and between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are kinsmen. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, then I will go to the right. If you take the right hand, then I will go to the left." So Abraham is basically showing faith that the Lord will provide for him. And Lot lifted up his eyes and saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord and like the land of Egypt in the direction of Zoar. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself all the Jordan Valley, and Lot journeyed east. Thus they separated from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the valley and moved his tent as far as Sodom. So you see, Lot chooses self. Abram makes the offer. They don't even try to think, how can we work this together? Lot chooses self. Abraham trusts in the Lord. So Lot chooses his own will and does not show total faith in God, while Abraham shows God's will in allowing Lot to choose the better land because he has faith God will provide. And it turns out Lot didn't really choose the better land. So it's often, what appears to be good. And think about that when we make decisions, right? Sometimes we're picking what appears to be the best thing, the candy bar. It's really not the thing that's best for us. Abraham continues to help Lot and even bargains with God for Lot's life. Yet Lot's moral relativism, his knowing better than God, causes the death of his wife and incestuous relationship with his two daughters. Now Lot went up to Zoar, so this is after Sodom and Gomorrah destroyed, and this is after his wife is turned to a pillar of salt, and lived in the hills with his two daughters, for he was afraid to live in Zoar. So he lived in a cave with his two daughters, and the firstborn said to the younger, "Our father is old, and there is not a man on earth to come into us after the manner of all the earth. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, that we may preserve offspring from our father." So they made their father drink wine that night, and the firstborn went in and lay with her father, and he did not know when she lay down or when she arose. The next day the firstborn said to the younger, "Behold, I lay last night with my father. Let us make him drink wine tonight also. Then you go in and lie with him, that we may preserve offspring from our father." So they made their father drink wine that night also, and the younger arose and lay with him, and he did not know where she lay down or when she arose. Lot is never making a decision with God in mind. He's never making a decision with God in mind. The whole story. A father who makes no decisions with God in mind has two daughters who make decisions without God in mind. One of the reasons I called this tribalism in the family, and one of the reasons we're using these stories in Esau and Jacob, is it's really hard for a lot of us, not all of us, to think about hating a sibling or a family member, or doing what we just read about Lot's daughters doing. That's impossible for us to think about. At least I hope it is. Thus both daughters of Lot became pregnant by their father, their firstborn son, and called his name Moab. The second, the father of the Moabites to this day. The younger also bore a son and called his name Ben-Ami, his father of the Ammonites to this day. From Lot's lack of faith and insisted on self, we get two new tribes, the Moabites and the Ammonites, both enemies of Israel. Tribalism and only choosing self have long-lasting effects. And I think as Christians, everywhere we see tribalism, we have to stamp it out in love. We have to model not being tribal. That's really hard to do. And it involves a lot of listening and not a lot of talking. Listening with a loving heart. Don't hear me saying with an open mind so you change your mind, but with a loving heart allows us to enter into the place the person who we disagree with is coming from. That skill develops the virtue charity. To be able to hear everything someone is saying in a charitable way. To hear it the best way you can hear it. So that when you do have the ability to respond, you can respond and the person will know that you know where they're coming from. Or to be able to express that you can't possibly know where they're coming from. These are the ways that we can kill off tribalism. Not by agreeing with those who are wrong or those who we disagree with, but by understanding them and their arguments and making sure they know we understand them, and then modeling agape love, selfless, self-giving love. Because eventually the question from that tribalistic person who you disagree with is going to be, why are you so loving? And you answer, because of Jesus. So we've seen with Cain and Abel a whole new tribe created. We see two new tribes created here. And these two tribes are enemies of Israel. Sarah, Sarai, and Hagar. This one is really heartbreaking. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. And you remember, Abraham was promised children from God. And he told Sarai, I've been promised. And she laughed at him. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abraham, behold, now the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my servant. It may be that I shall obtain children by her. And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. Typical man. Right? Oh, sure, okay. No argument from Abram. You think there would have been if he argued, there'd be something like, are you sure about that? I don't think that's such a good idea. And he's like, okay. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram, her husband, as a wife. And he went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress, and Sarai said to Abraham, may the wrong done to me be on you. It was your idea. So we see Sarah not consulting with God, doing it for someone else, and then realizing that this is bad. And of course, you see Hagar look with contempt on Sarah, which she's not allowed to do. So Sarah looking for any excuse to get rid of her. And the right thing in there? Angel of the Lord found Hagar by a spring of water in the wilderness, because they've kicked her out, on the way to Shur, and said, Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? She said, I am fleeing from my mistress, Sarai. The angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her. The angel of the Lord also said to her, I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude. Behold, you are pregnant and shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. And he shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone and everyone's hand against him. and he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen. And Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram called the name of his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram. Then, a couple chapters later, this is chapter 21 now, the Lord visited Sarah and he said, the Lord did to Sarah what he had said, what he had promised. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham, a son in his old age at the time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore him, Isaac. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 years old, and as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him, and Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. And she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. And then, as the child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned, but Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, who had borne to Abraham, laughing. So maybe laughing at Isaac. So she said to Abraham, cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman should not be heir with my son Isaac. And the thing was very displeasing to Abraham on account of his son. Now there we see that Abraham is displeased there, but when he was supposed to sleep with Hagar, he was not ever displeased. He just said, you got it. But God said to Abram, be not displeased because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you. For through Isaac shall your offspring be named. And I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also, because he is your offspring. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered into the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot, for she said, let me not look on the death of the child. And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what troubles you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Up, lift the boy, and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make him into a great nation. And God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. And she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. And God was with the boy, and he grew up. And he lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. These are the names of the sons of Ishmael. And we name all those sons, and you see what we have here. Ammon and Moab, the Moabites. You see the Judean Palestinians are their descendants. Ishmael, and eventually Esau, the Arabs in Saudi Arabia, and then you have the 12 tribes of Israel. And so what you have is tribalism. One of the things that troubles me a lot with this story is that God said, don't worry, I'll make a nation out of Ishmael too. And, that nation eventually, especially if you read the Islamic version of that, of this story, Abraham stays with Hagar and not with Sarah and stuff. And, boy, that's interesting. But the fact is, God knows the plan. At the first sin, God knows the plan that eventually Jesus will be the answer to bring all these tribes back together and to end tribalism. Now, that's never going to happen until the eschaton, right? That's the eschaton, the end times. That's not going to happen until Jesus returns and he obliterates evil and enables us all to see the truth, because we are not able to fully see. But it will happen, and it's our job to facilitate people knowing Jesus. So I would say that if in your life, whether it be with your family or your friends or your neighbors, if you notice yourself falling into a tribe that can't hear with compassion and charity other tribes, you are contributing to the tribalism we have in our society. If you are able to listen with charity to others, and not necessarily agree, but listen in charity and love sacrificially on them, you are doing something to end the tribalism that we encounter. And next week, we get into the twins, Jacob and Esau. And so we will have, start the Jacob and Esau story next week, and we will take a break for Ash Wednesday. And then we will conclude the Wednesday after Ash Wednesday. So next Wednesday we have class, and then it's Ash Wednesday, and then we'll have our third class. And we'll actually get into the Jacob and Esau story, and we'll really see tribalism taking part in a family where, as you know from the story, mother and father don't agree, and mother becomes a bit problematic. But what happens. I think it's really interesting to look at those sorts of breakouts and how tribalism in a family can affect a huge society of people, and how that's passed on from one generation to another. And so I'm going to stop the class now for those of you who are watching at home, and I'm going to open up questions here. And if you have questions about this class, feel free to email me, cwood@redeemersarasota.org. I find that listening to Q&A on a YouTube video doesn't work that well. So I'm going to shut the screen, the recording down now, and take questions from the live audience. If you have questions at home, again, email me. God bless you.